On Christmas Day in the year 1166, William of Normandy sat crowned in Westminster Abbey while his soldiers set fire to the houses outside, mistaking the cheers of the congregation for rebellion. The anointed king, barely understanding English, ruled a land that did not want him, surrounded by men who would kill him for less than the cost of a war horse. This was not the beginning of some fairy tale, but the beginning of a life spent calculating threats, negotiating with bishops, who held spiritual weapons more dangerous than swords, moving endlessly from castle to hunting lodge to battlefield, and obsessing over ledgers that never quite balanced. Medieval kingship, stripped of its legends and its gold leaf, was a condition of exhausting motion and perpetual vulnerability. Between the 11th and 14th centuries, across England, France, and the scattered territories of the Holy Roman Empire, men who wore crowns lived neither in luxury nor ease, but in a world where power meant managing violence, performing divinity, and surviving long enough to produce an heir. This account follows the rhythms of that power through the machinery of coronation and the logistics of war, through treasury chambers and forest hunts, through the sacred weight of anointing oil and the mundane compromises required to govern lands too vast to truly control. Consider the sheer physical demands. A king like Henry II of England, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, controlled territories stretching from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. He could not govern such an empire from a throne. Instead, he travelled constantly, covering as much as 2,000 miles in a single year on horseback and in jolting carts, trailed by a court of 150 to 300 people, clerks, chaplains, cooks, grooms, guards, and an ever-shifting crowd of petitioners, barons, and bishops. The king's wardrobe alone required wagons. His chapel travelled in pieces. His chancery carried parchment, ink, wax, and the great seal that turned a scrap of sheepskin into law. When the court arrived at a manor or abbey, it consumed everything: grain from the barns, animals from the fields, firewood from the forests, beds and floors and stables packed with bodies and horses. Then it moved on, leaving bills unpaid and local stores depleted, because a medieval king fed his government by eating his kingdom. This itinerancy was not a choice but a necessity. Without a standing army or a permanent bureaucracy, a king enforced his will through presence. He appeared at castles to remind sheriffs and castellans who held ultimate authority. He presided over courts to demonstrate that royal justice was real and accessible, not merely theoretical. He hunted in royal forests to assert his monopoly over deer and timber, and to remind local lords that even the wilderness belonged to the crown. He held great feasts at Christmas, Easter, and Pentecost, where the hierarchy of the realm was performed in seating arrangements, in the order of dishes, in who knelt and who stood. A king who stayed still was a king losing control. A king who moved kept his nobles guessing, his officers honest, and his coins circulating. But all that motion required money, and money was the most relentless problem any medieval king faced. Royal revenue came from a patchwork of sources, none reliable, most resented. There were rents from royal demesne lands. There were feudal dues owed when heirs inherited, when daughters married, when knights owed military service they preferred to pay off in cash. There were profits from royal courts, from markets, from mints, from customs on wool and wine. There were taxes on Jews who could be tillaged at will because they existed outside the normal feudal structure. There were forest fines levied on anyone caught hunting deer or taking timber without license, and still it was never enough. English royal revenue in the late 12th century stood at roughly £30,000 per year. By the early 14th century it had climbed to perhaps £60,000. These sums sound substantial until one considers the costs. A single campaign in Wales or Scotland could consume an entire year's income. Castle construction was ruinously expensive. Edward I spent over £1 million building castles in Wales, a sum that strained his treasury to breaking and forced him to borrow from Italian bankers at interest rates the church condemned as usury. Royal bankruptcy was not an occasional crisis but a chronic condition. Kings pawned their jewels, their plate, their crowns. They summoned parliaments and assemblies not out of democratic impulse, but out of desperate need for extraordinary taxation. And those assemblies learned quickly that the king's financial straits were their political leverage. The barons who forced King John to seal Magna Carta at Runnymede on June 15, 1215, were not revolutionaries. They were creditors calling in debts, landowners tired of arbitrary fines, and vassals refusing to keep paying for a king's military failures. The charter itself, for all its later mythologizing, was largely a list of financial grievances: limits on inheritance taxes, restrictions on forest law, promises that the king would stop seizing property without compensation. It was a budget negotiation written in Latin on parchment and enforced, briefly, by the threat of civil war. And civil war was always possible, because a king ruled not through institutions but through personal relationships, and personal relationships were volatile. A medieval king governed by making and keeping allies. He distributed lands, titles, marriages, and offices to men whose loyalty he needed. He mediated disputes among barons who might otherwise settle matters with private armies. He balanced the ambitions of his own sons, who often rebelled before their father's death rather than wait for a peaceful succession. He negotiated with the church, which could excommunicate him, place his kingdom under interdict, and release his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. He faced external enemies whose claims to his throne, his lands, or his vassals were backed by armies, marriage alliances, and their own anointed authority. Every king lived with the knowledge that deposition was possible, that imprisonment was a real risk, and that even anointed monarchs could be quietly murdered in castle cells if they lost the protection of their supporters. This was the reality behind the crown: not majesty but calculation, not ease but exhaustion, not absolute power but endless negotiation. A king woke each day to a schedule dictated by ritual and necessity: morning mass to demonstrate piety and receive divine favor, councils with advisors to hear petitions, settle disputes, issue charters, and make the hundreds of small decisions required to keep a kingdom from collapsing into private war. A midday feast eaten in public, where every baron and bishop watched to see who sat nearest the king, who received the best cuts of meat, who was ignored or humiliated. Afternoons given over to hunting, that obsessive aristocratic sport that was part recreation, part military training, part performance of royal privilege over forests that by law belonged to the crown alone. Evenings spent reviewing accounts, dictating letters, hearing reports from sheriffs and justices, signing documents that clerks had prepared in careful script. And then the same again tomorrow, and the day after, moving always, stopping nowhere long enough for enemies to gather or resentment to harden into rebellion. The coronation itself, that moment when a man became a king, was an extraordinary piece of political theatre. It happened once, and everything that followed depended on its legitimacy. The ceremony blended Old Testament kingship with Christian sacrament, transforming a secular lord into God's anointed representative on earth. The moment of anointing, when holy oil was placed on the king's head, hands, and chest, carried the same theological weight as priestly ordination. It marked the king as sacred, set apart, chosen. It gave him the authority to heal the sick through touch, to perform miracles, to speak with divine sanction. But it also bound him. Once anointed, a king could not easily be unmade. Deposing an anointed monarch meant confronting not just political legitimacy, but spiritual pollution, the sin of laying hands on God's chosen. That sacred protection, however, proved fragile in practice. Edward II of England was anointed at Westminster in 1308. 19 years later, he was deposed, imprisoned, and murdered at Berkeley Castle, his body displayed to prove he was truly dead. The holy oil had not saved him. What follows, then, is an examination of kingship as it existed in practice, not in theory. This is a portrait built from account rolls and chronicle complaints, from the itineraries reconstructed by historians tracing a king's movements through dated charters, from the material evidence of castles, coins, seals, and royal tombs. It begins where kingship began, with the making of kings. The ceremony began before dawn. In the great abbey church, servants hauled water to scrub floors, lit candles in iron sconces along the nave, and draped altar rails with embroidered silks that had travelled in locked chests from royal treasuries. Bishops arrived in procession, carrying reliquaries containing fragments of saints, accompanied by monks chanting psalms whose melodies predated the Norman invasion. Outside, crowds gathered in the cold, pressed against wooden barriers erected to keep order, their breath visible in the December air. The king-to-be waited in a side chamber, stripped of his travelling clothes, dressed in a linen tunic, specially made for this occasion. He would wear it only once. After today it would be cut into pieces and distributed as holy relics, cloth that had touched anointed flesh. Everything that happened next followed scripts centuries old, refined through repetition, until every gesture carried layers of meaning, understood by bishops, barons, and the crowd beyond the walls. Westminster Abbey was the site for English coronations by the late 11th century, chosen because Edward the Confessor had built it and been buried there, giving the location both royal and saintly legitimacy. In France, kings were crowned at Rheims, where Clovis, first Christian king of the Franks, had been baptized in 496. The cathedral at Rheims possessed a relic of extraordinary power, the Holy Ampulla, a small vessel said to contain oil brought from heaven by a dove at Clovis's baptism. Holy Roman emperors preferred Aachen, where Charlemagne had been buried and where his throne still stood, octagonal and simple, waiting for each new claimant to the imperial title. Geography mattered because legitimacy required continuity. A king needed to be crowned where other kings had been crowned, using the same objects, speaking the same oaths, receiving blessings from the same God who had sanctioned his predecessors. Innovation was dangerous. Deviation suggested illegitimacy. The sequence of the ceremony was carefully structured. First came the recognition, when the presiding archbishop presented the candidate to the assembled nobility and clergy, asking if they accepted him as king. This was theatre more than democracy. The outcome was predetermined, but the ritual asked the question nonetheless, creating a fiction of consent. Then followed the oath, in which the king-to-be swore to protect the church, maintain justice, and govern according to law. The specific wording varied by kingdom and century, but the essence remained consistent. Kingship was conditional, bound by promises made before God and witnesses. Only after the oath came the anointing, the moment that separated kings from other men. The holy oil was kept in vessels shaped like eagles or ampulla, small enough to be held in one hand. Its composition was debated and secret. Some recipes called for olive oil mixed with balsam and chrism blessed by bishops. Others included more exotic ingredients: myrrh, cinnamon, aromatic resins imported at great expense from the eastern Mediterranean. The oil used at Rheims was believed to be miraculous, never diminishing no matter how many kings were anointed with it. Whether this was true or whether French clergy quietly replenished the supply is unknowable, but the belief mattered more than the chemistry. The archbishop dipped his thumb into the oil and made the sign of the cross on the king's head, then on his chest and hands, sometimes also on his shoulders and arms. The touch transformed him. He was no longer merely a lord or duke, but a figure who stood between the human and the divine, anointed in the manner of David and Solomon, Old Testament kings whose legitimacy came directly from God. The biblical precedent was deliberate and explicit. Medieval theologians and chroniclers described kings as successors to the Israelite monarchy, chosen by God to lead Christian peoples just as David had led the tribes of Israel. This was not metaphor but typology, a way of reading history in which Old Testament events prefigured and justified present arrangements. Samuel had anointed Saul, and then David. Zadok the priest had anointed Solomon. The ritual performed in Westminster or Rheims was understood as a continuation of that same divine commission. It gave kings the authority to rule, but it also bound them to the responsibilities of Old Testament kingship: justice, protection of the weak, obedience to divine law. When kings failed, preachers and chroniclers reminded them that God had also deposed Saul for disobedience. The anointing was a gift, but it came with conditions that could be revoked. The archbishop, who performed the anointing, wielded extraordinary power in that moment. He was the mediator through whom divine sanction flowed, the only figure whose authority was necessary to make a king legitimate. This created tensions that shaped medieval politics for centuries. Kings needed bishops to crown them, but bishops needed kings to protect church property and enforce ecclesiastical authority over lay people. The relationship was symbiotic and unstable. When kings tried to appoint bishops without papal approval, the church accused them of usurping spiritual authority. When popes tried to depose kings, monarchs argued that anointing made them accountable only to God, not to any earthly priest. The investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries turned on precisely this question: who had the right to create the men who wielded sacred power? The struggle ended in compromise, but the underlying tension never disappeared. After the anointing came the bestowal of regalia, objects that symbolized different aspects of royal authority. The sword represented the king's duty to defend the realm and the church, to wage war against enemies and heretics. It was presented with a blessing asking God to grant the king strength and justice, the ability to protect the innocent and punish the wicked. The scepter, a staff topped with a cross or a fleur-de-lis, symbolized temporal authority, the king's right to command obedience and issue judgments. The orb, a golden sphere surmounted by a cross, represented the world itself, placed literally in the king's hand to signify his dominion under Christ. Some coronations included additional items: a ring to symbolize the king's marriage to his kingdom, gloves to indicate that his hands must remain clean of sin, spurs to mark his status as a knight. Each object was consecrated before being handed over, transforming utilitarian items into sacramental tools. The crown came last. It was placed on the king's head by the archbishop, while the choir sang the Te Deum, a hymn of praise so loud it could be heard by the crowds outside. The crown itself was heavy, made of gold set with gemstones, designed to be seen from a distance, to catch light and reflect it back as visible proof of majesty. English kings wore the crown of Edward the Confessor, made in the 11th century, and used at every coronation until it was melted down during the Civil War in the 1600s. French kings wore a different crown for the coronation at Reims, and another for daily use, because the sacred crown was too valuable and too symbolically important to risk in travel. Holy Roman emperors used a crown that dated to the late 10th century, octagonal in shape, decorated with enamel plaques depicting Old Testament kings, and inscribed with Latin texts proclaiming divine authority. These were not mere decoration, they were objects believed to carry power, to connect the man wearing them to all the men who had worn them before, to make visible a continuity that justified present rule. The ceremony concluded with a feast, held in the great hall of the palace adjacent to the church. The newly crowned king processed from the abbey, still wearing his regalia, to take his seat at the high table. Nobles were served according to rank, each course choreographed to display hierarchy and royal generosity. The feast could last hours, featuring dishes calculated to impress whole roasted swans, pies filled with live birds that flew out when the crust was cut, subtleties made of sugar and marzipan sculpted into castles or saints. Wine flowed in quantities that ensured drunkenness and the loosening of tongues, oaths of loyalty shouted across tables, songs praising the new king's lineage and virtue. This too was part of the coronation, a public demonstration that the king commanded not just spiritual authority, but material wealth, the resources to feed hundreds, and the power to summon the greatest lords of the realm to witness his elevation. But not all coronations proceeded smoothly. Contested successions produced incomplete or irregular ceremonies that haunted kings for years. Stephen of England was crowned in 1135, weeks after seizing the throne from his cousin Matilda, the designated heir. The speed suggested desperation, and many barons refused to attend, signalling their belief that his claim was illegitimate. The Archbishop of Canterbury performed the ceremony, but rumours circulated that he had done so under duress, that the anointing was therefore invalid. Stephen spent his entire reign fighting a civil war against Matilda, unable to secure the loyalty that a universally accepted coronation might have provided. King John of England was crowned in 1199 after his brother Richard died on campaign, but he faced immediate challenges from his nephew Arthur, who had a stronger hereditary claim. John's coronation was legal, but the swiftness with which he moved to secure it, and the absence of several key barons, left space for rivals to question his legitimacy. Delay was equally dangerous. Henry VI of England was crowned twice, once as an infant in 1429, and again in 1431 in Paris as King of France, fulfilling the terms of a treaty signed during the Hundred Years' War. The double coronation should have secured his position, but the years of regency, while he remained a child, undermined his authority, and by the time he reached adulthood, the political landscape had shifted in ways that made the earlier ceremonies feel hollow. The anointing had happened, but it had not created a king capable of ruling. He was deposed in 1461, briefly restored in 1470, and murdered in 1471. His anointed status no protection against the ambitions of rivals, who concluded that sacred kingship was less important than effective power. The ritual of coronation created kings, but it did not guarantee their survival. It gave them a language of legitimacy, a set of symbols and claims they could deploy to justify their rule, but those claims had to be continually reasserted through action. A king who failed to provide justice, who lost wars, who allowed his barons to drift into rebellion, who could not manage the church or secure his borders, discovered that holy oil offered no immunity from deposition or murder. The theatre of coronation was essential, but it was only the beginning. The real test came afterward, in the years of governance that followed, when the newly anointed king had to prove that the ritual had not been wasted on a man unworthy of the crown. But once the oil dried and the congregation dispersed, a king could not simply sit still and rule from a throne. Medieval monarchy was a condition of near constant motion. Once the oil dried and the congregation dispersed, a king could not simply sit still and rule from a throne. Medieval monarchy was a condition of near constant motion. The Norman and Angevin kings of England, the Capetians of France, and the Holy Roman emperors moved their courts across their realms with the regularity of seasons, trailing behind them households of 150 to 300 people, dozens of wagons loaded with documents and dishes, herds of horses, and all the material infrastructure of government packed into leather trunks and wooden chests. To be a medieval king was to live on the road, sleeping in a different hall every few nights, dispensing justice in borrowed chapels, eating venison supplied by nervous sheriffs, and governing an ungovernable territory through the simple fact of showing up. The reasons for this relentless itinerancy were both practical and symbolic. Medieval kingdoms lacked the administrative machinery to govern from a single capital. There were no police forces, no standing bureaucracies staffed by salaried clerks in distant provinces. Authority radiated outward from the king himself, and if he remained in one place too long, the edges of his realm would fray. Local lords would settle disputes according to their own interests. Sheriffs would pocket revenues meant for the royal treasury. Castles would fall into disrepair, or worse, into the hands of men with ambitions of their own. The king had to be seen, and seen often, if his word was to carry weight beyond the walls of Westminster or Paris. But there was another, more mundane reason for constant travel. Medieval royal revenue arrived largely in kind rather than coin. Estates produced grain, livestock, firewood, fodder, and ale, and these goods could not easily be transported across long distances on poor roads. It was far simpler to bring the court to the food than the food to the court. The royal household would descend on a manor, consume its stores over several days or weeks, then move on to the next estate before the larders ran bare. This system, efficient in its own grinding way, meant that the king was always eating his kingdom, one estate at a time. The logistics of moving such a household were staggering. The core of the travelling court included the chamber, which managed the king's personal needs and sleeping arrangements. The chapel, staffed by royal clergy, travelled with altars, vestments, relics and liturgical books packed in iron-bound chests. The chancery carried the written memory of the realm, including charters, correspondence, and the great rolls that recorded debts and grants. Clerks wrote on vellum by candlelight in unfamiliar rooms, sealing documents with the king's great seal, which was itself transported under guard. The kitchen required carts loaded with cauldrons, spits, knives, salt, spices, imported at great expense, and live animals driven on the hoof. The wardrobe managed not only the king's clothing, but also the household's financial accounts, functioning as a mobile treasury. The stable provided the transportation for all of this, with pack horses, riding horses, and wagon teams numbering in the hundreds. The itineraries of medieval kings can be reconstructed with surprising precision from financial records known as pipe rolls, and from the dating clauses of royal charters, which recorded where and when each document was issued. These sources reveal seasonal patterns. Kings favoured certain residences during particular times of year: Windsor for Easter, Westminster for Christmas, hunting lodges in the New Forest during autumn. Henry II of England, whose dominions stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees, covered astonishing distances. In a single year he might journey from Normandy to Anjou to England to Wales and back again, travelling over 2,000 miles on horseback and by ship. His chancery clerks, bouncing along in carts, must have envied the monks who stayed in one scriptorium their entire lives. The burden of this itinerancy fell heavily on those who hosted the court. Towns, abbeys, and baronial estates were required to provide lodging, food, fodder, and fuel under the system known as purveyance. In theory, the king paid for what he took. In practice, payment arrived late, or not at all, or in the form of promissory tallies that local suppliers could not easily convert to cash. A royal visit could strip a monastery's stores for months. A town might be required to provide hundreds of loaves of bread, barrels of wine, wagon loads of oats, and a steady supply of firewood, all while accommodating the rowdy soldiers and servants who followed the court like gulls behind a plough. Sheriffs scrambled to meet demands, knowing that failure to provision the king adequately could mean dismissal or worse. The resentment this caused was real and lasting. Chroniclers grumbled about the chaos and expense of royal visits. Abbots petitioned for exemptions, offering cash payments in lieu of hospitality. Barons built their halls with guest chambers sized deliberately small, a passive resistance against the prospect of housing the king and his retinue. The tension between the king's right to demand support and his subjects' capacity to provide it was one of the quiet, grinding conflicts that shaped medieval politics. When the barons of England confronted King John at Runnymede in 1215, among their complaints was the abuse of purveyance. Magna Carta included provisions limiting the king's ability to seize goods and horses without compensation, a rare acknowledgement that even royal necessity had limits. The travelling household was not merely a logistical challenge, but also a symbol of royal power. A king on the move demonstrated vitality, vigilance, and command. He arrived unannounced to inspect castles, hear cases, and remind local lords that their authority was delegated, not inherent. The royal presence transformed ordinary halls into theatres of majesty. When the king sat in judgment, petitioners knelt. When he dined, nobles competed for seats near his table. When he hunted, entire forests were cleared of peasants so that the royal chase could proceed unimpeded. The itinerant court was government as performance, and the performance required constant rehearsal across the width of the realm. Yet for the king himself, this ceaseless motion was exhausting. Medieval roads were rough, often impassable in winter, and dangerous year-round. Bandits haunted forests, bridges collapsed, rivers flooded. Kings rode in all weather, slept in cold halls, ate unfamiliar food, and dealt with the endless needs of courtiers and clerks who wanted decisions, favours, or simply his attention. The romantic image of a king enthroned in a great hall was, for most medieval monarchs, a rare luxury. The reality was saddle sores, aching joints, and nights spent in draughty chambers listening to the wind howl through wooden shutters. The itinerant court also created opportunities for competition and intrigue. Proximity to the king meant influence, and courtiers jockeyed constantly for position in the travelling household. To ride beside the king, to attend his council, to share his table was to matter. To be left behind at a distant manor was to be forgotten. Ambitious clerks sought positions in the chancery. Knights angled for places in the royal retinue. Bishops and magnates arranged their own travels to intersect with the king's, hoping for audiences that might secure grants or settle disputes. The court was not a fixed institution, but a mobile ecosystem of favour and rivalry, and the king was both its centre and its captive. This system persisted for centuries because it worked, after a fashion. It was personal government suited to a world without telegraphs or trains, where authority had to be embodied and enacted face to face. But it was also fragile. dependent on the king's health, energy, and ability to endure the grinding routine of motion. When kings grew old or ill, the itinerancy slowed. When they died, the household dissolved, waiting to reform around a successor who might or might not command the same loyalty. The itinerant court was a kingdom on the move, held together by habit, necessity, and the relentless will of the man wearing the crown. All that movement required money, and money in medieval kingdoms was neither plentiful nor easy to gather. All that movement required money, and money in medieval kingdoms was neither plentiful nor easy to gather. A king in the 12th century who wished to understand his wealth did not open a ledger showing coins stacked in vaults. He looked instead at a patchwork manors scattered across shires, forests thick with deer and legal restrictions, harbours where wool and wine changed hands, courts where fines were levied, vassals who owed service or its cash equivalent, and a constantly shifting mass of obligations that existed more on parchment than in any strongbox. Royal revenue was not a single stream but a maze of trickles, each with its own customs, each requiring its own officials to chase, record, and defend. The king who ignored this maze would find himself unable to pay soldiers, unable to build castles, unable to survive. The foundation of royal income was land, and not just any land. The demesne consisted of estates held directly by the crown, manors whose rents and produce flowed to the king rather than to a tenant or vassal. These lands might produce grain, livestock, timber, or simply cash rents from peasants who worked them. In England, William the Conqueror had seized roughly 1/5 of the kingdom's land for the crown after 1066, ensuring that his successors would not depend entirely on the cooperation of barons. By the reign of Henry II, royal demesnes stretched across dozens of counties, administered by sheriffs and reeves who collected what was owed and delivered it to the travelling court or to regional treasuries. But land alone was never enough. The king needed feudal incidents, those moments when the structure of vassalage generated cash. When a tenant died, the king claimed relief, a payment from the heir to inherit the estate. If the heir was a minor, the king took wardship, controlling the estate and pocketing its revenues until the child came of age. If the heir was a daughter, the king sold her marriage, auctioning the right to wed her and control her inheritance. These were not abuses but standard features of the system, expected and legally enforceable, though they bred resentment when applied too aggressively. The forests were another matter entirely. In England, vast stretches of woodland and heath were declared royal forest, subject to forest law rather than common law. This did not mean the land was empty or unused. Villagers lived within forest boundaries, farmed their fields and grazed their animals, but they did so under restrictions that could ruin them. Hunting deer was forbidden. Cutting timber required permission. Even keeping a dog necessitated mutilation of its paws to prevent it from chasing game. Forest courts met regularly to fine those who violated these laws, and the fines were steep enough to matter. The forest was not primarily about conservation or sport. It was a revenue engine, a way to tax activity that occurred on land the king claimed, but did not directly farm. Henry II expanded the forests aggressively, and by the early 13th century, roughly 1/3 of England was subject to forest law. The resentment this caused would surface in Magna Carta, which demanded that forests be reduced to their earlier boundaries. Trade provided another stream, though a smaller one than kings would have liked. Customs duties on wool exports, taxes on wine imports, tolls collected at markets and bridges, fees from boroughs that sought royal charters granting them the right to self-governance. These revenues grew slowly over the 12th and 13th centuries as commerce expanded, but they remained modest compared to what land and feudal dues provided. The exception was during periods of war or emergency, when kings imposed extraordinary levies. Tollage was a direct tax on towns and royal demesne, assessed without consent and collected irregularly. Scutage, shield money, was paid by vassals in lieu of military service, a recognition that 40 days of feudal obligation rarely sufficed for a long campaign. Kings pushed scutage rates higher and collected it more frequently, turning it from an occasional substitute into a regular tax, but this created friction. Barons resented paying for wars they had not approved, and the question of who could authorize such levies became one of the defining struggles between crown and magnates. The machinery that tracked all this was the exchequer, and it was a thing of surprising sophistication. Twice a year, at Easter and Michaelmas, sheriffs and other officials travelled to Westminster to account for the revenues they had collected. They stood before a large table covered with a checkered cloth, each square representing a sum of money. Counters were moved across the cloth as clerks calculated totals, a visual abacus that gave the institution its name. The sheriffs presented their receipts, explained shortfalls, and were questioned by the barons of the exchequer, officials who combined financial and judicial authority. Everything was recorded on long rolls of parchment, stitched end to end, which came to be called pipe rolls. These rolls listed every farm of a shire, every feudal payment, every fine from every court, creating an annual snapshot of royal finance. The earliest surviving pipe roll dates to 1130, during the reign of Henry I, and they continued for centuries, offering historians an extraordinary window into the mechanics of medieval revenue. The system was rigorous, but it revealed a persistent problem. Theoretical revenue and actual cash rarely matched. A sheriff might owe £500 from his shire, but a portion of that was still owed to him by knights who had not yet paid their scutage, or by villagers who had fled after a bad harvest, or by estates where the heir was in dispute. The sheriff might deliver £300 in coin and ask for allowances on the rest, hoping the exchequer would accept his explanations. Even when money did reach the treasury, it often went out again almost immediately. Castles needed repair, soldiers needed wages, envoys needed expenses for travel to Rome or Paris. The king himself needed ready coin for gifts, bribes, and the daily costs of his itinerant court. The gap between what was owed and what could be spent was chronic, and it forced kings into the arms of moneylenders. Jewish financiers, operating under royal protection and subject to royal exploitation, provided short-term loans at high interest. Italian banking houses, with their networks across Europe, advanced larger sums against future revenues. Kings borrowed constantly, and the debt compounded. When Edward I embarked on his Welsh campaigns in the late 13th century, he spent over £1 million on castles alone, a sum that dwarfed annual revenues and required borrowing on a scale that strained every available source of credit. Taxation beyond the traditional streams required consent, or at least the pretense of it. Kings summoned councils of barons and prelates to approve extraordinary levies, arguing that the defence of the realm or some urgent necessity justified the burden. Barons pushed back, demanding concessions in exchange for their approval. The negotiations were blunt. A king who needed money for war in France might promise to respect baronial rights, to limit forest law, to hear grievances before imposing new taxes. These promises were written down, sealed, and promptly ignored if the king recovered his leverage. Magna Carta in 1215 was less a triumph of liberty than a codification of fiscal disputes, a list of restrictions on royal revenue extraction forced upon King John by barons who had grown tired of funding his failures. The principle that extraordinary taxation required consent became embedded, however imperfectly, in English governance, setting the stage for later parliaments. But consent or no, bankruptcy was always near. A king who could not pay his soldiers watched them desert or turn to plunder. A king who owed money to magnates found himself dependent on their continued goodwill, unable to discipline or dismiss them without risking rebellion. A king who defaulted on loans to foreign bankers damaged his credit and found future borrowing more expensive or impossible. Insolvency was not a rare crisis, but a recurring condition, managed rather than solved. Kings pawned crown jewels, sold privileges, granted charters to towns in exchange for upfront payments, and squeezed their Jewish subjects through arbitrary tollages until there was little left to squeeze. Philip IV of France, desperate for revenue in the early 14th century, destroyed the Knights Templar and seized their assets, a brutal solution that revealed how far a king might go when ordinary sources failed. The fiscal machinery of medieval kingship was impressive in its reach and record-keeping, but it could not overcome the fundamental constraints of an agrarian economy with limited monetization, slow communication, and a landowning class that had its own income and its own armies. A king was rich compared to a peasant, but poor compared to his ambitions. He ruled a kingdom but could not command its wealth at will. Every penny was contested, every tax required justification or force, and the gap between the grandeur of the throne and the emptiness of the treasury was a source of endless frustration and frequent catastrophe. Money paid for one thing above all else: the ability to make war, the defining activity of any medieval king who wished to remain one. Money paid for one thing above all else: the ability to make war, the defining activity of any medieval king who wished to remain one. A monarch who could not fight, or who lost too often, did not stay monarch for long. War was the grammar of medieval politics. Disputes over inheritance, borders, feudal obligations, insults real or imagined, all resolved themselves through violence or the credible threat of it. Diplomacy consisted largely of calculating whether a campaign could be afforded and whether an army could be assembled before the enemy assembled his. Peace was simply the interval spent preparing for the next war. The crown required not just money and ritual, but the ability to organize, equip, and deploy hundreds or thousands of armed men across vast distances, keep them fed and paid, and lead them personally into situations where death waited behind every hedgerow and hill fort. In theory, medieval kings commanded vast military resources through the feudal system. A lord who held land from the crown owed military service in exchange. Knights and barons were expected to answer the royal summons, bringing retinues equipped with horses, armor, and weapons. This was not charity, it was rent paid in steel. The obligation was old, woven into the fabric of landholding, since the Normans formalized it in England, and similar structures took root in France and the German territories. But the theory concealed a thicket of complications. Feudal service was limited. The standard obligation was 40 days per year. 40 days was enough to muster, march to a nearby border, conduct a brief siege or skirmish, and return home before the harvest rotted in the fields. It was not enough to conquer a kingdom, hold distant territory, or conduct a sustained campaign across the Channel or into Wales. When a king needed his army for longer, he had to negotiate, cajole, or pay. Disputes erupted constantly. A baron might owe service for 10 nights, but claim the obligation applied only to defensive wars, or only within the kingdom, or only when his own lands were not threatened. Some vassals argued that castle guard duty, the requirement to garrison a royal fortress for a set period each year, fulfilled the obligation entirely, freeing them from riding to war. Others offered scourdage, a cash payment in place of service, calculated per night owed. Scourdage was convenient for kings who preferred hiring professionals, but it also revealed the system's fragility. If a lord could buy his way out of fighting, then feudal obligation was not a bond of loyalty but a transaction, subject to the same haggling as any other tax. By the late 12th century, English kings collected scourdage regularly. It was useful revenue, but it meant that the theoretical army existed mostly on parchment. The reality of royal armies was messier and more expensive. Kings relied heavily on household knights, permanent retainers who lived in or near the court, received wages, food, and lodging, and followed the king wherever he went. These men were professionals. They trained constantly, owned quality equipment, and had no harvest to worry about. A household of 50 to 100 such knights formed the core of any royal army, the reliable centre around which temporary levies and feudal contingents could be organized. But even household knights were not enough. Major campaigns required mercenaries. These were men who fought for pay and plunder, bound by contract rather than fealty, often drawn from regions where poverty or war had made soldiering the only trade. Flemish crossbowmen, Welsh spearmen, Brabançon routiers. Companies of these men could be hired by the month or season. They were effective, brutal, and utterly indifferent to the politics of the kingdoms they ravaged. Routiers in particular developed grim reputations. They were landless, stateless, loyal only to silver, and when contracts expired or pay ran short, they simply switched employers or turned to banditry. The church condemned them regularly. Kings hired them constantly. By the 13th century, the shift toward paid retinues was irreversible. Edward I of England waged his Welsh and Scottish wars almost entirely with contracted soldiers. Feudal obligations still existed, still mattered in law and ceremony, but the actual armies were assembled through indentures, written contracts specifying length of service, rates of pay and obligations. A knight might contract to serve for 6 months with 2 squires and 4 horses in exchange for specified wages and a share of ransoms. This was war as business. It worked, in the sense that it produced armies, but it chained kings to their revenues. A campaign could not be launched until the treasury had enough silver to pay the first installment. A war could not continue once the money ran out. This was why kings obsessed over taxation, loans, and the Jews and Lombards who might advance funds against future income. Moving an army required logistical miracles performed on staggering scales. A force of several thousand men and horses consumed astonishing quantities of food, fodder, and equipment daily: grain, salted meat, cheese, beer, wine, hay, oats, horseshoes, nails, bowstrings, arrows, spare weapons, clothing, tents, cooking pots, surgical tools, and a dozen other necessities had to be assembled, transported, and distributed across distances measured in weeks of travel. Supply trains stretched for miles, vulnerable to ambush, slow and prone to breaking down on bad roads or during river crossings. Royal officials requisitioned supplies from towns and monasteries along the route, sometimes paying, sometimes simply taking. This was purveyance again, but applied to war. The resentment was enormous. A royal army passing through a region could strip it bare, leaving famine in its wake. Castles were both objectives and anchors. Taking a castle required either a prolonged siege or enough siege equipment to breach walls quickly. Siege engines, trebuchets, mangonels, battering rams, siege towers were expensive and difficult to transport. Trebuchets could be built on site if timber and skilled carpenters were available, but moving one pre-assembled across terrain required teams of oxen and engineers who understood weight distribution and balance. Edward I brought prefabricated siege components to Wales, shipped by sea and assembled near target castles. The logistics were staggering, but they worked. Castles fell. Provisioning a castle for defense was equally complex. Garrisons needed months of food, water sources that could not be poisoned, secure storage for weapons, and enough men to defend walls that might stretch hundreds of yards. A determined attacker could starve a garrison into surrender simply by waiting. Time was a weapon, but it required supply lines that could sustain a besieging army longer than the defenders could hold out. This was mathematics written in grain sacks and barrels of salted fish. Coordination across distances challenged every campaign. A king in Normandy ordering a rendezvous with troops from England and Anjou depended on messengers travelling safely, weather holding long enough for channel crossings, and local commanders interpreting orders correctly. Plans disintegrated under the friction of distance and circumstance. Armies arrived late, undersupplied, or not at all. Allies proved unreliable. The weather turned. Disease swept camps. Keeping an army together and functional for months on end was an achievement in itself, regardless of whether it won battles. Kings were expected to fight personally. This was not optional. A king who commanded from a distance risked losing the respect of his soldiers and the loyalty of his nobles. Medieval warfare valorized personal courage, and courage meant visible presence in the melee. Kings wore distinctive surcoats and rode better horses, making them targets, but retreating or avoiding battle marked a king as cowardly or weak, a reputation that could prove fatal politically. The risk was genuine. At the Battle of Bouvines in 1214, Philip II of France found himself surrounded, dragged from his horse, and nearly killed before his household knights rescued him. The battle was won, but the memory lingered. A king could die in an instant, unhorsed and trampled, struck by an arrow meant for someone else, or captured and held for ransom that might bankrupt a kingdom. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 illustrated the cost of failure. Edward II of England led a massive, well-equipped army into Scotland to relieve Stirling Castle. Robert the Bruce commanded a smaller Scottish force on ground he had chosen carefully. The English vanguard stumbled into terrain unsuitable for cavalry, packed too tightly, and became vulnerable to Scottish schiltrons. dense formations of spearmen, the English fled. Edward himself barely escaped, his reputation shattered. The defeat emboldened his enemies at home and destroyed any pretense of English dominance in Scotland. A single battle could undo years of campaigning and drain the political capital a king needed to govern. Victory created its own problems. Captured nobles were valuable, ransomed back to their families for sums that could fund further campaigns. The ransom economy was elaborate and brutal. A captured knight might spend years in genteel captivity, his family mortgaging estates to raise the sum demanded. Kings captured in battle fetched extraordinary ransoms. Richard I of England, captured on his way back from crusade in 1192, cost his kingdom 150,000 marks, a sum so large it required extraordinary taxation and the melting down of church plate. Ransom was profit, but it was also politics. Releasing a dangerous rival for silver might simply fund his next rebellion. Killing a captured king or noble was rare, considered barbaric, but keeping him imprisoned indefinitely risked making him a martyr. Territorial conquest required holding what had been taken. Castles had to be garrisoned, local lords coerced or bribed into loyalty, supply lines secured, and rebellions suppressed before they spread. Conquest was expensive in perpetuity. William the Conqueror spent decades after 1066 crushing English resistance, building castles, and replacing Saxon lords with Normans. The Normans held England because they built hundreds of castles and filled them with soldiers paid from English revenues. But even then, control was partial. The north remained restive. Wales resisted. Scotland was never conquered. Conquest was fragile, always contested, always one rebellion away from unraveling. Defeat meant more than lost battles. It meant lost revenue, lost prestige, lost allies who recalculated their loyalty based on the latest outcome. A defeated king faced demands from his own barons who used military failure as leverage to extract concessions. King John lost Normandy to Philip II in 1204, a catastrophe that diminished English royal power and contributed directly to the baronial revolt that produced Magna Carta. Loss was cumulative. Each defeat weakened the structures that made future victories possible. War was policy, but it was also performance. A king who won battles demonstrated divine favor, martial skill, and the qualities that justified his rule. A king who lost demonstrated the opposite. The margin between the two was often luck, weather, or the competence of subordinates, but the consequences were absolute. When not at war, a king was expected to impose order within his realm, a task as difficult as any campaign and far less glorious. When not at war, a king was expected to impose order within his realm, a task as difficult as any campaign and far less glorious. The maintenance of peace did not mean an absence of violence, but rather its careful administration. Justice was not something abstract or distant. It arrived on horseback in the person of the king or his representatives, carrying rolls of parchment and the authority to hang. The notion that a king owed justice to his subjects was older than any kingdom in Europe. It stretched back through Carolingian capitularies and Visigothic codes to Roman law and beyond, into the unwritten expectations of Germanic custom. A king who failed to provide justice lost legitimacy as surely as one who lost battles. But what justice meant in practice was a question answered differently in Westminster, Paris, and Aachen. In England, by the 12th century, royal justice had become the most effective instrument of royal power, more reliable than castles, and cheaper than mercenaries. It was also deeply resented. The king's court, the Curia Regis, followed him wherever he went. It was not a place but a gathering of men, barons, bishops, justices, and clerks, who heard disputes too important or too complicated for local lords to settle. Cases involving land tenure, violent crimes committed on royal highways, disputes between tenants of different lords, accusations of treason, all these flowed upward toward the king. Some he heard himself. Most he delegated to trained justices, men learned in law, who travelled circuits through the shires, hearing cases in the king's name. These itinerant justices were one of the great innovations of Norman and Angevin kingship. They brought the authority of the crown into villages that might see the king himself once in a generation, if ever. The assizes, as these judicial sessions were called, followed predictable routes and calendars. Justices arrived with writs and commissions, empowered to hear pleas of the crown and common pleas between subjects. They summoned juries, examined witnesses, and issued judgments that could not be appealed except to the king. The expansion of this system under Henry II transformed English governance. By 1170, royal justices were hearing thousands of cases annually, each one generating fees, fines, and written records that fed into the exchequer. Justice was a service, but it was also a business. Every land dispute, every accusation of theft or assault, every inheritance contest brought revenue into the king's coffers. The Pipe Rules recorded these sums with bureaucratic precision: 40 shillings for a writ of novel disseisin, 5 marks for a jury verdict, £10 for the king's pardon after an accidental homicide. The system worked because it was faster, more predictable, and more accessible than baronial justice, which could be capricious or corrupt. Freemen with a grievance could purchase a royal writ and have their case heard before impartial justices, rather than the lord against whom they were complaining. This was revolutionary, and it made the king rich. It also made him indispensable, but the extension of royal justice came with exclusions and contradictions that poisoned relations between crown and subjects. Forest law was the starkest example. Forests in the legal sense were not merely wooded areas but territories declared by royal prerogative to be reserves for the king's hunting. By the end of the 12th century, nearly 1/3 of England lay under forest law. Within these bounds, a separate and savage legal code applied. Killing a deer was punished with blinding or castration. Taking wood without permission, grazing livestock, clearing land for farming, all these ordinary acts of survival became crimes. Forest courts met irregularly, presided over by royal foresters who extracted fines and confiscated property with little oversight. The resentment this caused was immense. The Charter of the Forest, sealed alongside Magna Carta in 1215, was an attempt to limit the king's forest jurisdiction to disafforest lands and restore common rights. It was largely ignored. The mechanics of proving guilt or innocence varied by crime and century. In the early 12th century, trial by ordeal remained common for serious accusations where evidence was scarce. The accused might be required to carry a heated iron bar for 9 paces or plunge a hand into boiling water to retrieve a stone. The wound was bandaged, and 3 days later a priest inspected it. If it had begun to heal cleanly, God had declared the person innocent. If it festered, guilt was proven. The ordeal was a liturgical event, accompanied by prayers and fasting conducted within church walls or under clerical supervision. It was expensive, which limited its use to cases where much was at stake. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade clerical participation in ordeals, and the practice collapsed within a generation. England replaced it with jury verdicts, groups of local men sworn to declare what they knew or believed about a case. Trial by combat persisted longer, particularly in disputes over land. 2 claimants, or their hired champions, fought with staff and leather shield until one yielded or died. God, it was assumed, would favor the righteous. The church disapproved but could not abolish a procedure embedded in aristocratic honor culture. Juries did not deliberate in the modern sense. They were witnesses drawn from the neighborhood, expected to already know the facts. 12 men sworn to speak truly about whether a certain field belonged to this abbey or that knight, whether a man accused of robbery had been seen with stolen goods, whether a widow was entitled to her dower. Justices examined them, but rarely called additional testimony. The jury's collective knowledge or prejudice was the evidence. This system grew rapidly because it was cheaper and faster than ordeals or combat, and because it allowed the crown to process more cases and collect more revenue. Royal justice was at its most visible and most theatrical in executions. Hanging was the standard punishment for theft and murder, carried out at crossroads or prominent hills where crowds could gather. The condemned were carted from prison, sometimes allowed to speak, then hanged by the neck until dead. Their bodies might be left to rot as warnings, or buried in unsanctified ground. The king's justice was public, performed before witnesses who could carry the lesson home. High-profile executions were rarer and far more elaborate. Traitors were drawn on hurdles through the streets, hanged until nearly dead, cut down, disemboweled, beheaded, and quartered. The pieces were displayed in different towns. The violence was intended to be exemplary, a spectacle of royal power that separated treason from ordinary crime. Yet the king also possessed the power to pardon, and this was wielded as carefully as the sword. Mercy was a political tool. A king who pardoned too freely appeared weak. One who pardoned too seldom appeared tyrannical. The calculation varied by circumstance. A rebel baron might be executed to deter others or pardoned to reconcile his heirs and retain their lands in loyal hands. A merchant convicted of smuggling might purchase a pardon for a steep fine, replenishing the treasury. A murderer might be pardoned if he agreed to serve in a foreign campaign. Royal mercy was transactional. It reinforced hierarchy and demonstrated that the king stood above the law he enforced. This exception to the rules was not a flaw in the system. It was the system. The tension between royal justice and baronial privilege ran through every assizes, every forest ire, every disputed inheritance. Barons resented the expansion of royal courts into matters they considered their own jurisdiction. They objected to being summoned to Westminster to answer for actions taken on their own estates. They protested the cost of writs, the venality of sheriffs, the unpredictability of forest law. Magna Carta in 1215 was, among other things, a protest against the abuse of royal justice. It demanded that justice not be sold, delayed, or denied. It insisted that barons be judged by their peers, not by royal justices who owed their positions to the king. It sought to limit forest boundaries and abolish arbitrary fines. King John sealed the charter under duress, renounced it within weeks, and died before it could be enforced. His son's regency government reissued it repeatedly, stripped of its most radical clauses, until it became part of the structure of English law. But the compromise was always fragile. Justice, as medieval kings understood it, was not blind or impartial. It was an expression of authority, a performance of order in a world that teetered constantly toward chaos. It enriched the crown, disciplined the unruly, and reminded every subject that the king's reach extended into the village square, the forest clearing, and the inheritance dispute over a half-acre strip of ploughland. It was resented because it worked. But kings did not rule by law and force alone. They governed also through ritual, symbol, and the careful management of a vast extended family. A royal wedding was not a celebration. It was a contract written in flesh, negotiated over months or years by men who never intended to attend the ceremony. When Eleanor of Aquitaine married Louis of France in 1137, she brought with her the richest duchy in Western Europe, vineyards and ports that made her worth more than the crown itself. When she divorced him 15 years later and married Henry of Anjou within 8 weeks, she shifted the balance of power across 2 kingdoms. The marriage bed was a battlefield by other means, and every king knew that the wrong bride could cost him a throne, while the right one might win him 3. Royal marriage began in chanceries and council chambers, not chapels. Ambassadors carried proposals across hundreds of miles, bearing letters sealed with wax and offers calculated down to the last manor and mill. A princess was inventory, her bloodline assessed for hereditary taints, her age and health evaluated for childbearing capacity, her dowry measured against her father's ability to deliver it in coin, land, or soldiers. The negotiations could take years. When Edward I of England sought a bride for his son in 1299, his envoys visited Flanders, Holland, Guelders, and Savoy, compiling dossiers on eligible daughters and comparing the strategic worth of each alliance. The girl herself, wherever she was, waited to learn which kingdom she would join, which language she would need to speak, and whether she would ever see her family again. Dowries moved in both directions, though the mechanics varied. The bride brought wealth or territory to her husband's house, but the groom's family owed her a dower, lands assigned for her support should she outlive him. These arrangements could reshape borders. When Philip II of France married Isabel of Hainaut in 1180, Her dowry included Artois, giving France a critical foothold in Flanders. Dower lands became a political problem when queens survived their husbands by decades, holding revenue that kings needed for war. Royal widows were not powerless. Eleanor of Aquitaine outlived 2 husbands and spent her 70s leading troops, arranging marriages for her grandchildren, and maneuvering through civil wars that would have broken men half her age. The wedding itself followed choreography as rigid as a coronation. Contracts were read aloud in the presence of bishops and notaries. Rings were exchanged. Vows were spoken in Latin, sometimes by brides who did not understand the words. The couple was blessed. The mass was sung, and then came the part that mattered most to everyone except the bride and groom, the consummation. Witnesses accompanied the couple to the bridal chamber, observed the bed, and sometimes remained outside the door to confirm that the marriage had been completed. This was not prurience but necessity. An unconsummated marriage could be annulled. An annulment was a tool kings used when they tired of wives who produced no sons. The presence of witnesses turned a private act into a public fact, binding the alliance in law and flesh. Queens existed to bear heirs, and the pressure was immediate. A royal marriage without sons was a political catastrophe in slow motion. Henry I of England had one legitimate son, William Adelin, who drowned in 1120 when his ship struck a rock off the Normandy coast. Henry remarried within weeks, desperate for another boy, but his second queen produced only stillbirths. He died in 1135, leaving his daughter Matilda as his heir, and England collapsed into 19 years of civil war, because too many barons refused to accept a woman as their sovereign. This was the anarchy, castles changing hands every season, fields burned, coin hoarded, law ignored. Stephen of Blois seized the throne, Matilda invaded, and the kingdom bled until Matilda's son came of age and negotiated a peace that left thousands dead for want of a single living prince. Childbirth killed queens as efficiently as it killed peasant women. Medicine offered almost nothing. Physicians prescribed prayers, relics, and herbal mixtures that did no harm because they did nothing at all. When labor went wrong, the mother usually died, sometimes along with the child. Queens who survived one birth faced another within 2 years, and another after that, until they produced enough sons to secure the succession, or their bodies gave out. Isabella of France, wife of Edward II, bore 4 children in 8 years. Eleanor of Castile, wife of Edward I, bore at least 14 in 36 years, and only 6 survived childhood. The royal nursery was a graveyard with velvet curtains. Infant mortality carved through royal families without regard for rank or wealth. Children died of fevers, accidents, infections that no one understood. The sons of Louis VIII of France died one after another in the 1220s. Philip at 13, too young to inherit. John and Alphonse survived longer but left no children. Only Louis IX lived to adulthood and kingship, and his survival looked less like policy than providence. Kings tried everything. They endowed monasteries and promised crusades in exchange for prayers. Queens went on pilgrimage to shrines famous for granting fertility: Canterbury, Walsingham, Rocamadour. They wore relics against their skin and drank water blessed by saints. None of it worked reliably, because nothing worked reliably. A dynasty's survival came down to chance, and kings knew it. The sons who survived infancy were raised for war and rule from the moment they could hold a wooden sword. Training began around age 7. Boys learned to ride, to fight with blade and lance, to endure the weight of mail and the exhaustion of a day in armor. They were tutored in Latin, taught to read charters and compose letters, drilled in the genealogies and landholdings of their father's vassals. This was not education for its own sake. It was preparation for the only career available to a royal son, kingship, or the endless effort to seize it. Some kings crowned their heirs during their own lifetimes, attempting to secure the succession and prevent disputes. Henry II crowned his son, Henry the Young King, in 1170, but the boy died in 1183, still waiting for his father to die. The coronation had meant nothing. France avoided succession crises by accident of biology. From 987 to 1316, every Capetian king produced a son who survived to adulthood, an unbroken line of male heirs across 3 centuries. Historians called it the Capetian miracle, but it was only luck, the sort of luck that could not last. When it finally failed in 1316 with the death of Louis X's infant son, France faced its first serious succession dispute in generations. The solution was to invent a rule that excluded women from inheriting the throne, a principle borrowed from Salic law and applied retroactively to justify whatever the barons had already decided to do. England had no such luck and no such rule. Disputed successions were common, and they ended in war more often than negotiation. The Holy Roman Empire rejected hereditary succession entirely, at least in theory. The emperor was elected by a small group of powerful princes, archbishops, dukes and counts whose votes could be bought, threatened or promised away years in advance. In practice, powerful families tried to monopolize the throne. The Hohenstaufen dynasty held it for much of the 12th and 13th centuries, but every transition required fresh negotiation, bribery, and the risk that a rival family would outbid them. Frederick Barbarossa spent decades fighting to keep his crown and pass it to his son. When Frederick died on crusade in 1190, his son Henry inherited the title, but had to fight for another 6 years to make it mean anything. Elections produced emperors, but only wars produced obedience. Bastards complicated everything. Kings fathered children outside marriage constantly, and many of those children were raised at court, given land, married into noble families, and used as tools of diplomacy. But they could not inherit the throne. The distinction between legitimate and illegitimate birth was absolute, maintained by the church and enforced by law. When a king died without legitimate sons, his bastards were ignored, no matter how talented or well-loved. William the Conqueror had been a bastard himself, son of Robert of Normandy and a tanner's daughter, and the label followed him his entire life. His enemies called him William the Bastard in negotiations and treaties. It did not stop him from conquering England, but it meant his own sons spent their reigns fighting to prove their legitimacy was beyond question. Regencies were periods of controlled chaos. When a king died, leaving a child as heir, someone had to rule in the child's name until he came of age, and that someone was usually the queen mother, a powerful uncle, or a coalition of barons who could not agree on anything except their shared desire to avoid civil war. Regents governed under constant suspicion. Were they protecting the child king's interests, or their own? Were they preparing to step aside, or preparing to hold power indefinitely? Henry III of England inherited the throne at age 9 in 1216, and his regents spent the next decade fighting rebellions, negotiating with the papacy, and trying to restore order after his father's disastrous reign. Henry finally took personal control in 1227, but the regency had taught the barons that a child king was an opportunity, and they never fully trusted him afterward. Deposition was always possible, even for anointed kings, if enough barons decided that legitimacy mattered less than survival. Edward II of England was forced to abdicate in 1327 after years of military failure and alleged incompetence. His wife and her lover orchestrated the deposition, gathered a council of lords and bishops, and declared that the king had forfeited his crown. Edward's son was crowned in his place, and Edward himself disappeared into imprisonment. The official story was that he died of natural causes in September of that year. No one believed it. The speed of his death, the secrecy surrounding his burial, and the lack of any public viewing of the body all suggested murder, though no one was ever charged. Deposing a king required legal fiction and careful choreography, but killing one required only a locked room and men willing to do what needed to be done. Succession crises revealed how fragile royal authority truly was. A king ruled because enough people agreed that he should, and the moment that agreement dissolved, the crown became a prize to fight over rather than a symbol to obey. The machinery of government froze during interregna. Sheriffs stopped collecting taxes, judges stopped traveling, soldiers stopped mustering. Every baron with an army calculated whether he could improve his position by backing a rival claimant or by waiting to see who won. The kingdom did not collapse, but it paused, holding its breath, until someone seized power decisively enough to make resistance more dangerous than obedience. And so kings spent their reigns obsessing over bloodlines, marriages, and the contents of royal cradles. They married for treaties, divorced for sons, and remarried within weeks when their queens died in childbirth. They raised their children as weapons and contingencies, knowing that a single fever could undo decades of planning. They watched rival branches of their own families, monitoring cousins and nephews who might someday claim better blood or stronger support. Kingship was not inherited peacefully. It was negotiated, fought over, and justified after the fact by whoever managed to hold it long enough to commission a chronicle. A king's authority, however carefully constructed, was never absolute. It was always contested, negotiated, and constrained by the church. A king knelt in a cathedral and felt holy oil touch his forehead, and in that moment he became something more than a man with a sword and a claim. The ritual transformed him into God's chosen instrument, anointed as the Old Testament priests and kings had been anointed, marked with chrism, blessed by bishops whose authority flowed from Rome. Yet that same oil created a permanent problem. If a king ruled by divine sanction, granted through the hands of churchmen, then what happened when the king and the church disagreed about who held ultimate authority over the souls and lands of Christendom? The question hung over medieval monarchy like fog over a marsh, obscuring the boundaries between spiritual and temporal power until someone stepped wrong and sank. The bishops who placed crowns on royal heads were not simply ceremonial assistants. They controlled access to salvation itself, or so the theology insisted. They administered sacraments without which no Christian could hope for heaven. They owned vast estates, commanded feudal loyalty, collected tithes, and operated networks of monasteries and churches that reached into every village in Europe. A king might command armies, but a bishop could threaten something worse than death. Excommunication severed a soul from the community of believers. Interdict closed the churches of an entire kingdom, silencing the bells, halting the masses, leaving the dead unburied in consecrated ground. These were weapons no sword could answer. The collision came earliest and hardest over the appointment of bishops themselves. By the 11th century, kings across Europe had grown accustomed to selecting the men who would hold the great episcopal sees, treating them as royal appointments much like sheriffs or castellans. The logic seemed obvious. Bishops controlled land, wealth, and administrative expertise. They sat in royal councils, commanded troops from their estates, and served as chancellors and diplomats. To allow the church to appoint such men without royal input struck kings as suicidal, an invitation to see their own kingdoms governed by officials loyal to a foreign pope. But the papacy, particularly after the reforms initiated under Gregory VII, saw the matter differently. Bishops were spiritual officers, successors to the apostles, and their appointment belonged to the church alone. Kings who claimed the right to invest bishops with ring and staff were usurping sacred authority, tainting the church with the sin of simony and the corruption of lay interference. The struggle reached its crisis in the Holy Roman Empire. Henry IV, crowned King of Germany in 1056 while still a child, grew into a ruler determined to control the German bishops who were essential to imperial administration. When Gregory VII declared in 1075 that lay investiture was forbidden, Henry responded by attempting to depose the Pope. Gregory excommunicated Henry in 1076. The sentence was not merely symbolic. It released Henry's vassals from their oaths of loyalty, and the German nobles, always eager for leverage against their king, threatened to elect a new monarch unless Henry reconciled with Rome within a year. Henry, facing rebellion and the collapse of his authority, travelled south in the winter of 1077. He crossed the Alps in January, a desperate journey through snow and cold, and appeared at the gates of Canossa, the castle where Gregory was staying. For 3 days, Henry stood outside in the courtyard, barefoot in the snow, dressed in the coarse wool of a penitent, begging forgiveness. Gregory, trapped by his own theology of mercy, finally admitted him and lifted the excommunication. Henry had submitted, but he had also bought time. Within 3 years he was at war with Gregory again, and the conflict would smoulder for decades, unresolved, a permanent fault line in the structure of medieval Christendom. England produced its own collision, more personal and just as bitter. Henry II, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, appointed his friend and Chancellor Thomas Becket as Archbishop of Canterbury in 1162. Henry assumed Becket would remain a compliant ally, a royal servant in ecclesiastical robes. Becket transformed. He resigned the chancellorship, adopted the austere habits of a reforming cleric, and began defending the privileges of the English Church against royal encroachment. The dispute centered on legal jurisdiction. Henry wanted clergy accused of crimes to be tried in royal courts, where punishments included mutilation and death. Becket insisted that clergy could only be judged in church courts, where the worst penalty was defrocking. The argument escalated through years of embassies, councils, and Becket's eventual exile to France. When Becket returned to England in 1170, the conflict reignited immediately. Henry, holding court in Normandy and hearing reports of Becket's defiance, reportedly shouted in frustration about the archbishop's obstruction. 4 knights, interpreting the king's anger as an order, crossed the Channel, rode to Canterbury, and on December 29, 1170, murdered Becket in his own cathedral, striking him down near the altar as monks fled in horror. The killing created a public relations catastrophe. Becket became a martyr within days, miracles were reported at his tomb within weeks, and pilgrims began arriving in numbers that would make Canterbury one of the wealthiest shrines in Europe. Henry, genuinely shocked by the murder and terrified of its consequences, submitted to public penance. In 1174 he walked barefoot through the streets of Canterbury, entered the crypt where Becket was buried, stripped to the waist, and allowed himself to be scourged by monks while he prayed. The spectacle served its purpose. Henry's submission diffused calls for interdict or excommunication, and he retained his throne. But the compromise that followed acknowledged the Church's control over clerical discipline, a permanent limitation on royal justice. Pope Innocent III, who reigned from 1198 to 1216, demonstrated just how far papal authority could reach when wielded without hesitation. King John of England, already unpopular and financially desperate, quarrelled with Innocent over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1205. John wanted his candidate. Innocent insisted on Stephen Langton, an English theologian teaching in Paris. When John refused, Innocent placed England under interdict in 1208. The churches closed, masses ceased, baptisms and marriages continued only in stripped-down private forms. The dead were buried in ditches and fields, unsanctified. The interdict lasted 6 years, a psychological siege that isolated John from his subjects and weakened his legitimacy. In 1209, Innocent excommunicated John personally. By 1213, with barons already plotting rebellion, and Philip II of France threatening invasion with papal blessing, John capitulated entirely. He accepted Langton as archbishop, agreed to pay compensation to the church, and went further. He declared himself a papal vassal, surrendering England and Ireland to Innocent and receiving them back as fiefs, promising an annual tribute of 1,000 marks. The submission was calculated humiliation, but it secured papal protection at the moment John needed it most. When the barons forced John to seal Magna Carta in 1215, Innocent annulled it within weeks, citing his authority over his royal vassal. Yet kings were not simply victims of the church. They used religion as aggressively as popes used excommunication. Taking the cross and vowing to join a crusade granted a king immediate spiritual prestige, a halo of sanctity that could erase a reputation for tyranny or vice. It also brought practical advantages. Crusaders enjoyed papal protection for their lands and debts during their absence, a suspension of legal threats that could be politically invaluable. Richard I of England spent only 6 months of his 10-year reign in his kingdom, dedicating years to the Third Crusade and his subsequent captivity and wars in France. His absence nearly bankrupted England, but his crusading reputation transformed him into a legend, a Christian warrior whose failures were forgiven because his cause was holy. Louis IX of France went further. He led 2 crusades in 1248 and 1270, the latter ending with his death from dysentery in Tunisia. His piety was extraordinary even by medieval standards. He wore a hair shirt, washed the feet of lepers, heard cases personally from petitioners who approached him under an oak tree at Vincennes, and was canonized 27 years after his death. His crusading zeal served political purposes as well. It unified fractious nobles under a shared holy purpose, channeled the violent energies of his knights away from civil war, and positioned the French monarchy as the moral leader of Catholic Europe. The financial cost was staggering. Crusades consumed royal revenues for years in advance, requiring new taxes, loans from Italian bankers, and the liquidation of crown assets. But the spiritual and political returns, at least for kings who survived, often justified the expense. The church gave kings their crowns and their claim to rule as representatives of divine order. It also constrained them, judged them, and held weapons that no army could defeat. The balance shifted depending on the strength of the pope, the popularity of the king, and the willingness of nobles and bishops to exploit the conflict for their own advantage. No king could afford to ignore the church. No pope could depose a king without the cooperation of that king's own subjects. The result was a permanent negotiation, carried out through councils and embassies, punctuated by dramatic confrontations, and always shaped by the uncomfortable truth that both sides needed the other to maintain the fiction that Christendom was a unified, divinely ordered whole. Away from altars and battlefields, the king's day was filled with less exalted business: eating, hunting, hearing petitions, and managing the machinery of a personal face-to-face government. Away from altars and battlefields, the king's day was filled with less exalted business: eating, hunting, hearing petitions, and managing the machinery of a personal face-to-face government. Medieval monarchy was not a condition of leisure, but of continuous performance, a role played before audiences of servants, petitioners, barons, and foreign envoys who watched for signs of weakness, favour, or opportunity. Every meal was theatre, every hunt was politics, every writ sealed in the king's name was a small assertion of power in a world where authority had to be demonstrated constantly, or it ceased to exist. The day began before dawn. A king rose in his chamber to the sound of attendants preparing water in basins, folding linens, laying out clothing chosen the night before by the officials of the wardrobe. There was no privacy in this. Chamberlains and body servants dressed the king, fastened clasps, adjusted tunics and mantles. The rooms smelled of wool and candle wax and sometimes incense, if a chapel stood nearby. In winter the stone walls held the cold. In summer they provided little relief. Kings moved through their mornings in spaces shared with a rotating cast of household officials whose presence was both service and surveillance. Morning mass came next, held in the royal chapel or in whatever church the itinerant court had reached the night before. This was not optional. A king attended mass daily, kneeling before the altar, receiving communion, observing the liturgy with the same disciplined attention expected of monks. The act reinforced the sacred dimension of kingship, the anointing that separated a crowned monarch from other men. Chaplains and confessors attended the king constantly, their prayers and counsel woven into the rhythms of governance. In England, royal chapels were staffed by educated clerics, who also served as scribes and record keepers, their spiritual duties inseparable from administrative labour. The chapel was both sanctuary and office. After Mass, the king moved to the hall or chamber, where councils convened. This was the Curia Regis, the royal court, a flexible body that included trusted barons, bishops, household officers, and specialized clerks. There was no fixed membership. Those who attended depended on who traveled with the king at any given time, who held relevant expertise, and who enjoyed royal favor. The Curia heard petitions, discussed military plans, resolved disputes over land and inheritance, and issued judgments in the king's name. It was the engine of medieval governance, operating without formal rules or written constitution, relying instead on custom, precedent, and the king's personal authority to lend weight to its decisions. Petitions arrived constantly. A widow sought justice against a lord who had seized her dower lands. A merchant requested safe conduct through royal forests. An abbot asked confirmation of a charter granted by the king's father. Bishops brought disputes over ecclesiastical jurisdiction. Barons complained about neighbours encroaching on their estates. The king could not possibly hear every case, but he was expected to appear attentive, to nod, to ask questions, to delegate decisions to trusted advisers while maintaining the appearance of personal judgment. This was exhausting work, requiring patience, memory, and the ability to distinguish genuine grievances from attempts at manipulation. Kings who ignored petitions or delegated too freely risked alienating the very people whose loyalty held the realm together. Written documents multiplied as the 12th and 13th centuries progressed. Royal government produced an ever-growing archive of charters, writs, letters, patent, letters close, and administrative records. The English Chancery, headed by the Chancellor, travelled with the king and operated wherever the court stopped. Clerks wrote in Latin on parchment, inscribing grants of land, confirmations of privileges, orders to sheriffs, and safe conducts for travellers. Each document was authenticated by the royal seal, a disc of wax impressed with the king's image on horseback or enthroned, the physical proof that the words on parchment carried the weight of majesty. The seal was kept locked in the wardrobe, guarded carefully, because a stolen or forged seal could issue commands indistinguishable from the king's own will. Kings varied in their literacy. Some read Latin fluently and composed letters themselves. Others relied entirely on clerks to draft, read aloud, and explain the contents of incoming correspondence. Henry II of England was famously literate, capable of reading legal documents and theological texts, a man who argued with bishops and could follow the logic of canon law. His son John kept a library and took an active interest in the wording of charters, correcting drafts and demanding precision. Frederick Barbarossa, by contrast, depended heavily on his chancery officials, men trained in the revived Roman law taught at Bologna, whose expertise he trusted, but whose reasoning he did not always follow. Literacy was useful but not essential. What mattered was control over the apparatus of written governance, the ability to command the production of documents that turned royal will into enforceable policy. By midday, the court assembled for the feast. This was the most public moment of the royal day, a meal staged as spectacle and consumed under the gaze of hundreds. The king sat at the high table on a dais, elevated above the hall, flanked by queens, visiting magnates, bishops, and honoured guests. Below, the household arrayed itself according to strict hierarchy, barons and knights at tables near the front, household officers and lesser servants further back, grooms and kitchen staff standing or eating in antechambers. Seating was never casual. Placement communicated favour, rank, and political alignment. To be seated near the king was a mark of trust. To be moved farther away was a public demotion. The food arrived in procession. Servants carried platters of roasted meat, venison and boar from the royal forests, swans and herons and peacocks in full plumage, pies filled with spiced pork and dried fruits, thick pottages of beans and onions, white bread for the high table and coarser loaves for those below. Wine flowed from the cellars, imported from Gascony and the Rhineland, served in silver cups for the king, and in wooden or pewter vessels for others. The quantities were staggering. A major feast for a royal court could consume hundreds of loaves, dozens of animals, barrels of wine, and pounds of expensive spices, pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves brought from the markets of Venice and Genoa at ruinous cost. The meal was both sustenance and display, a demonstration that the king commanded resources beyond the reach of ordinary men. Courses followed one another slowly. Between servings, minstrels performed, jongleurs juggled, or heralds announced the arrival of new guests. Conversation filled the hall, a dull roar of voices punctuated by laughter and the clatter of knives on wooden trenchers. The king ate under scrutiny, his every gesture observed. Did he favour one baron with extended conversation? Did he laugh at a jest told by a visiting lord? Did he drink heavily or maintain sobriety? These details mattered. They were reported, analysed, repeated in letters sent to distant courts. A king's table manners, his generosity with food and attention, his mood and temperament, all contributed to his reputation. A sullen or withdrawn king invited rumours of illness, weakness, or divine displeasure. A jovial, open-handed king who shared his food and laughter built loyalty, even if the underlying finances were collapsing. After the meal, the afternoon stretched open. Kings often hunted. This was not recreation but obsession, pursued with an intensity that bordered on mania. Forests belonged to the crown, vast reserves of deer, boar, and game birds protected by savage laws that punished poaching with mutilation or death. Hunting parties assembled in the courtyard, the king on horseback, surrounded by huntsmen with hounds, beaters to flush game from cover, archers and spearmen to make the kill. The chase could last hours, ranging miles through woodland, crashing through undergrowth, following the baying of dogs and the calls of horns. It was violent, dangerous, physically demanding. Riders fell from horses, boars turned and gored attackers, arrows went astray. Yet kings returned to the hunt obsessively. William II of England died in a hunting accident in the New Forest in the year 1100, struck by an arrow under circumstances that remain suspicious. Richard I hunted whenever campaigns allowed. Edward I maintained massive hunting lodges and bred hounds with the care other men reserved for war horses. Hunting was both sport and symbol, a performance of masculine prowess, a display of dominance over nature, and a metaphor for the king's authority over the realm. The forests were his. The animals were his. The right to kill them belonged to him alone, a privilege fiercely defended and endlessly enacted. Falconry offered a more refined variation. Kings kept hawks and falcons, trained by specialist falconers who travelled with the court, birds worth fortunes, hooded and jessed, carried on gloved wrists. A well-trained peregrine could strike a heron in mid-flight, a spectacle of speed and violence that delighted medieval audiences. Falconry required patience, skill, and the kind of attention to detail that mirrored the work of governance itself. Careful training, constant vigilance, rewards and corrections, the management of a creature both useful and unpredictable. Some kings preferred it to the chaos of the chase. When not hunting, the afternoon held more councils, more petitions, more administrative labour. The machinery of governance did not pause. Sheriffs sent reports, tax collectors submitted accounts, castles requested funds for repairs, disputes over forest boundaries required adjudication. The king moved through this work surrounded by clerks and advisors, men like Ranulph de Glanville or Hubert Walter in England, trusted servants who understood law, finance, and the thousand small compromises that kept the realm functioning. These were not feudal magnates but professionals, men promoted for competence rather than birth, whose loyalty depended on continued royal favour and whose influence grew as the complexity of government increased. Delegation was essential, but it carried risks. A king who relied too heavily on a single advisor invited jealousy and faction. Barons resented the rise of low-born clerks who whispered in the royal ear and controlled access to the king's presence. Accusations of sorcery, corruption, or undue influence followed powerful ministers like shadows. Yet without delegation, the work was impossible. No single man could hear every case, inspect every castle, audit every account, and still lead armies and negotiate treaties. Medieval kingship was a performance of personal rule supported by an increasingly elaborate infrastructure of written records and professional administrators, a tension never fully resolved. Evening brought supper, a lighter meal than the midday feast, often taken in the chamber with a smaller group, then bed, though not silence. The chamber filled again with attendants preparing the king for sleep, servants banking fires, guards posted outside the door. Even in rest, a king was never alone. Even in darkness, the machinery of monarchy continued, clerks copying writs by candlelight, messengers riding through the night with urgent news, the great household breathing and stirring around the still figure beneath embroidered coverlets. It was a life without pause, a rhythm of public performance and private calculation that ground down even the strongest. The crown demanded everything: presence, attention, judgment, generosity, courage, endurance. It offered in return only the fragile, contested claim to rule, a title that could vanish in a single battle or a whispered conspiracy. Yet no matter how carefully a king performed his role, the throne itself was never secure. Deposition was always possible. A king who failed could not simply resign. Medieval monarchy offered no mechanism for graceful retirement, no pension or country estate where a tired ruler might live out his days in peace. The crown was seized at birth or conquest, held through strength and legitimacy, and surrendered only through death or catastrophe. When a king lost the confidence of his magnates, the loyalty of his soldiers, or the favour of God, what followed was not electoral defeat, but something far older and more dangerous. Deposition was always possible, occasionally necessary, and never without blood. The rhetoric of removing an anointed king required careful construction. No baron, however powerful, could simply announce that he disliked the current monarch and intended to replace him. The act of deposing a ruler touched the same sacred authority that had placed the crown on his head in the first place. Justifications needed to be compelling, public, and rooted in theology or law. The language of deposition spoke of tyranny, of kings who ruled not for the common good but for their own appetites. It invoked incompetence, the failure to defend the realm or maintain justice. Most powerfully, it suggested divine displeasure, arguing that God himself had withdrawn favor from a ruler whose sins or failures had become intolerable. These arguments were rarely invented from whole cloth. Failed kings provided ample material for their own downfall. King John of England never quite lost his throne, but he came closer than any monarch of his era without being formally deposed. By the year 1215, John had lost Normandy, quarrelled catastrophically with Pope Innocent III, and alienated virtually every significant baron in his kingdom. The catalogue of complaints was long and specific. He demanded excessive payments for relief when heirs inherited estates. He sold justice to the highest bidder and delayed it for those who could not pay. He seized castles on flimsy pretexts, took hostages from noble families, and married heiresses to his favourites without consent. His military failures cost vassals their lands in France, and his expensive attempts to recover them cost vassals their money at home. By spring of 1215, the realm was in open rebellion. The barons, who forced John to seal Magna Carta at Runnymede on June 15th, framed their demands not as revolution, but as restoration. They claimed to be returning the kingdom to the good laws of Edward the Confessor and Henry I, to ancient customs John had violated. The charter itself begins not with accusations but with a grant, as though John were freely bestowing liberties rather than submitting to armed coercion. This legal fiction mattered. It allowed the barons to present themselves as conservatives, not rebels, and it stopped just short of declaring John unfit to rule. The threat, however, was implicit. If a king could be forced to sign away portions of his power, he could presumably be forced to sign away the crown itself. John understood this perfectly, which is why he immediately sought papal annulment of the charter and prepared for civil war. Edward II of England crossed the line John had approached but never reached. Edward inherited his father's throne in 1307 and spent the next 20 years demonstrating that competence was not hereditary. He lavished attention and treasure on a series of male favourites, beginning with Piers Gaveston, a Gascon knight of modest birth, whom Edward made Earl of Cornwall, and appeared to love with an intensity that horrified the barons. Gaveston was murdered by magnates in 1312, but Edward's reliance on favourites continued with Hugh Despenser the Younger and his father. Meanwhile, Edward lost a catastrophic battle to Robert Bruce at Bannockburn in 1314, surrendering English claims in Scotland. His wife Isabella of France despised him. His barons regarded him as weak, vindictive, and disturbingly uninterested in the traditional performances of kingship. By 1326, Isabella had taken a lover, Roger Mortimer, and invaded England with a small army. Edward fled west but was captured in Wales in November of 1326. What followed was unprecedented in English history. A parliament was summoned for January 1327, and a list of charges was prepared. Edward was accused of incompetence, of being controlled by evil counsellors, of losing Scotland and lands in France, of breaking his coronation oath, of fleeing rather than defending the realm. The language carefully avoided calling him a tyrant, which might justify popular rebellion, but it painted a picture of a man incapable of kingship. On January 24, 1327, a delegation visited Edward at Kenilworth Castle and informed him that if he did not abdicate voluntarily, his son would be passed over in favour of another candidate. Edward wept, fainted, and eventually agreed. His 14-year-old son was crowned Edward III on February 1st. The problem of what to do with a living former king had no good solution. Edward II remained anointed, remained the father of the current king, and remained alive. He was moved from castle to castle, held in increasingly harsh conditions, and finally imprisoned at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire. On September 21st, 1327, he died. The official story claimed natural causes, or perhaps grief. The rumours, which began immediately and were widely believed, spoke of murder. Later chronicles offered vivid, horrifying details involving a red-hot poker and internal injuries that left no external marks. Whether these accounts were true or embellished, they reflected a basic understanding. An anointed king could not simply be executed in public like a traitor. The act of killing him required secrecy, deniability, and methods that allowed for official lies. The death of any king, deposed or otherwise, created a moment of extraordinary vulnerability. Medieval governance was intensely personal, built on oaths sworn to a specific individual rather than to an abstract state. When that individual died, the oaths theoretically lapsed. Rivals could press claims, magnates could renegotiate terms, and foreign enemies could invade during the confusion. Speed mattered desperately. When William II of England died in a hunting accident in the New Forest on August 2nd, 1100, his younger brother Henry raced to Winchester, seized the royal treasury, and had himself crowned at Westminster 3 days later. His older brother Robert, who had a stronger claim, was returning from crusade and arrived too late to contest the succession. Royal deaths in battle carried their own particular horror. When Harold Godwinson fell at Hastings in 1066, his body was so mutilated that it could only be identified by marks known to his mistress. William the Conqueror himself died in September 1087 from internal injuries suffered when his horse stumbled during the sack of Nantes. He lingered for weeks in agony before dying in a monastery near Rouen. His attendants stripped the corpse and fled, fearing they would be blamed or forced to pay for the funeral. The body lay alone until a local knight paid for its transport to Kazan. At the burial, the stone sarcophagus proved too small. When attendants forced the swollen corpse into the space, it burst, filling the church with such a stench that the ceremony was hastily concluded. Crusade claimed kings with particular frequency, removing them thousands of miles from home and making the return of their remains a logistical and spiritual crisis. Frederick Barbarossa, Holy Roman Emperor, drowned crossing a river in Cilicia in June 1190 while leading the Third Crusade. His body was briefly preserved in vinegar, but the heat of Anatolia made transport impossible. He was buried in pieces, flesh in one location, bones in another, with only fragments eventually reaching Jerusalem. Louis IX of France died of dysentery during his Second Crusade in August 1270, camped outside Tunis. His body was boiled to separate flesh from bone, a process called mos teutonicus, so that his skeleton could be transported back to France for burial at Saint Denis. His entrails were buried in Tunisia, his flesh in Sicily, his bones in Paris. A king could be divided in death, as his lands were divided in life. The swiftness of transition astonished even those who lived through it. When Henry I of England died in December 1135, Stephen of Blois heard the news in Boulogne, crossed the Channel, reached London, convinced enough barons to support him, and was crowned at Westminster on December 22nd, less than 3 weeks after Henry's death. Speed created legitimacy. The first man crowned was often the man who kept the crown, regardless of the legal strength of his claim. This is why rival claimants sometimes arranged for multiple coronations, why dying kings tried to have their heirs crowned during their own lifetimes, and why control of Westminster Abbey or Reims Cathedral was worth garrisoning with troops. Deposition and death revealed what coronation and anointing concealed. Kingship was not a permanent transformation but a temporary agreement, renewed daily through displays of competence, generosity, and force. The oil that made a king sacred did not make him invulnerable. It made killing him more complicated, more secretive, and more necessary to disguise as accident or illness or divine judgment. The difference between a successful reign and a disastrous one often came down to luck, whether heirs survived childhood, whether harvests were good, whether key vassals remained loyal, whether the king died in his bed rather than in a prison cell with his killers standing over him in the dark. And so the cycle began again, with another coronation, another anointing, another man burdened with a crown that promised everything and guaranteed nothing. The crown was heaviest in stillness. A king might ride 50 miles in a day, preside over judgments until dusk, feast with 300 voices filling a timber hall, and fall into bed too tired to fear the morning. But in those rare moments when the court paused, when councils adjourned and petitioners dispersed, the weight settled fully. A man might sit alone in a stone chamber, candles burning low, and realize that every person in the kingdom wanted something from him or wanted him gone. Medieval kingship was not a station of comfort or security. It was a form of endurance. The physical cost alone would have broken most men. A king in his prime spent more time on horseback than in any bed. Henry II of England, who ruled from 1154 to 1189, traversed an empire stretching from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees. His itineraries, reconstructed from chancery records, show him covering more than 2,000 miles some years, moving between castles, forests, and coastal ports, with an entourage of 200 souls and wagons loaded with charters, coins, and chapel plate. He aged quickly. By his 50s, his legs ached, his temper frayed, and his sons were already circling. Philip II of France, who reigned from 1180 to 1223, fought 17 campaigns in 43 years. Edward I of England spent his final years prosecuting wars in Scotland, while suffering from dysentery so severe that his physicians travelled with him constantly. He died in 1207 on the road to yet another siege, unable to finish what he had started. Kings wore out their bodies the way soldiers wore out swords. The political cost was worse. A medieval king governed through personal relationships sustained by proximity, gift-giving, and the careful rationing of favour. Every baron expected access. Every bishop claimed spiritual authority that trumped mere temporal rule. Every merchant hoped for a charter. Every knight wanted recognition. A king who withdrew, who ruled through deputies, or remained too long in one place, risked losing the invisible threads that held power together. But a king who gave too freely, who promised more than his treasury could provide, became contemptible. The balance was impossible to maintain. King John of England, forced to seal Magna Carta in 1215 at Runnymede, had spent years oscillating between petty cruelty and desperate concession. His barons no longer believed his word. His treasury could not fund the wars he needed to restore his reputation. He died the following year, sick and humiliated, having lost half his father's empire and most of his dignity. The throne passed to his 9-year-old son, and England stumbled into a regency that lasted a decade. The myth that surrounded kingship made failure even harder to bear. Coronation ceremonies declared that kings ruled by divine sanction, anointed with holy oil in imitation of Old Testament kings. Chroniclers praised successful monarchs as instruments of divine justice and condemned unsuccessful ones as tyrants cursed by heaven. But the gap between myth and reality was vast. A king anointed at Reims or Westminster wielded no more inherent authority than his ability to coerce, negotiate, or inspire could generate. He commanded no standing army. He controlled no professional bureaucracy capable of governing in his absence. His writs held force only where sheriffs and castellans chose to enforce them. Beyond the reach of his household and the loyalty of his immediate vassals, his power dissolved into local custom, baronial prerogative, and the violent discretion of men who owed him 40 days of military service per year and considered that obligation fulfilled. Medieval kings claimed to rule kingdoms. In practice, they managed coalitions. What they actually controlled was startlingly narrow. A king held demesne lands, forests reserved for hunting, the profits of justice in royal courts, customs revenue from ports, and feudal dues owed at predictable intervals. He could summon men to war, though they might arrive late, leave early, or demand payment. He could issue charters and judgments, though enforcement depended on others. He could imprison rivals, but imprisonment required castles, guards, and the political will to endure the backlash. Edward II of England, deposed in 1327, discovered that a king without allies was merely a man in a stone room. His captors moved him from castle to castle, and in September of that year, he was murdered at Berkeley Castle in Gloucestershire under circumstances so brutal that chroniclers wrote of it in whispers. The anointed king, the man who had worn the crown for 20 years, died in filth and terror because the coalition that had elevated him dissolved. His authority, once he lost the ability to reward or threaten, evaporated as though it had never existed. Yet medieval kingship left a legacy that outlasted any single reign. The administrative machinery kings built to extract revenue, settle disputes, and enforce their will became the skeletal structure of later states. The English exchequer, which audited sheriffs twice yearly and recorded every transaction on parchment rolls, evolved into a permanent institution that survived incompetent kings and civil wars. The royal courts that heard property disputes and criminal cases under Henry II expanded into a common law system that operated independently of royal whim. In France, Philip II's innovations in record-keeping and his strategic use of bailiffs to govern provinces laid foundations for centralized administration that his successors would expand. Even the failures of medieval monarchy proved instructive. Magna Carta, sealed under duress, became a template for limiting royal power through written agreement. The English parliamentary assemblies that began as forums for extraordinary taxation evolved into legislative bodies with independent authority. Kings built these systems to serve their immediate needs. Those systems outlived them and constrained their heirs. The human cost, however, was not institutional. It was measured in sleepless nights and poisoned cups and sons who could not wait for fathers to die. Medieval kings lived in a condition of permanent suspicion. Trust was a luxury they could not afford. Even family members became threats. Henry II spent his final years fighting rebellions led by his own sons, backed by his estranged wife and funded by the King of France. Louis IX of France, canonized in 1297 as Saint Louis, was unusually beloved by his subjects. Yet even he faced a baronial revolt in 1230. Edward I of England, one of the most militarily successful kings of his age, died estranged from his eldest son, who would go on to lose everything his father had won. The throne isolated its occupant. Courtiers offered flattery or counsel shaped by self-interest. Barons sought advantage. Bishops reminded kings of their mortality and their sins. A king might host 300 people at a feast and speak honestly to none of them. Some kings broke under the pressure. Edward II grew erratic, favouring unworthy companions and ignoring counsel. His barons grew contemptuous. His wife fled to France, and his own son was crowned in his place. Richard II of England, crowned in 1377 at age 10, never escaped the trauma of watching his kingdom nearly torn apart during the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. He grew paranoid, vindictive, and obsessed with the trappings of majesty. By 1399, his support had collapsed. He was deposed and imprisoned, dying in captivity under mysterious circumstances in 1400. The throne demanded more than most men possessed. It required the ability to project strength while negotiating weakness, to perform certainty while drowning in doubt, to appear merciful while ordering executions, and to remain visible while living in constant fear of the visible target that visibility created. And so the cycle continued. Kings were made, ruled, and unmade with a regularity that suggested the institution itself was stronger than any individual who occupied it. Coronations followed funerals with indecent speed. Courts moved, councils convened, writs were sealed, wars were waged, and the machinery of kingship ground onward, regardless of whether the man wearing the crown was competent, beloved, or even sane. The medieval monarchy was not a person. It was a performance sustained by hundreds of people who had learned their parts, a set of expectations and rituals and record-keeping practices that persisted because they served the interests of enough powerful people to keep them alive. The king himself was, in a sense, replaceable. The crown was not.